The sound of vintage jewelry clinking together filled the quiet room as King Charles III carefully lifted each precious piece from Diana's personal collection. What should have been a simple task of cataloging his late ex-wife's belongings for their sons turned into a moment that would shake him to his core. Hidden beneath layers of silk and decades of memories, a single folded piece of paper waited to reveal secrets that Diana had kept locked away for over 25 years. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, elegant, flowing, and filled with words that would challenge everything Charles thought he knew about their marriage, their divorce, and the tragic night in Paris that changed the world forever. As his trembling fingers unfolded the note, Charles had no idea he was about to discover Diana's most closely guarded truth, one that would force him to question not only his past but also his future as King of England. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. Others demand to be heard, even from beyond the grave. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows of Kensington Palace cast long shadows across the mahogany desk where King Charles III sat surrounded by boxes of his late ex-wife's personal belongings. It had been 26 years since Princess Diana's tragic death, and, finally, he had mustered the courage to sort through her most intimate possessions. The task had been postponed countless times, always finding excuses to delay what felt like an invasion of privacy, even after all these years. His private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, had suggested that the king might want to personally review Diana's jewelry collection before it was officially catalogued for William and Harry. There were pieces of historical significance, family heirlooms that needed proper documentation, and personal items that might hold sentimental value for his sons. Charles had agreed, though reluctantly, knowing that each piece would carry memories of happier times and bitter disappointments alike. The first box contained her formal jewelry, the Spencer tiara she had worn on their wedding day, various necklaces gifted by foreign dignitaries, and the Cambridge lover's knot tiara that had once belonged to Queen Mary. Charles handled each piece with reverence, remembering how radiant Diana had looked wearing them during state dinners and royal engagements. Her natural grace had transformed these cold pieces of precious metal and stones into something magical, something that seemed to glow with her inner light. As he moved to the second box, Charles noticed it was smaller, more personal. The pieces inside were simpler, her everyday jewelry, gifts from friends, and items she had purchased herself during her years of independence after their separation. There was the gold Cartier watch she had worn constantly, a simple pearl necklace that had belonged to her grandmother, and several pairs of earrings he remembered her wearing during casual outings with William and Harry. At the bottom of this second box, wrapped in a soft blue silk scarf that still carried the faint scent of her favorite perfume, was Diana's most treasured jewelry box. It was small, elegant, made of polished wood with her initials engraved in flowing script on the lid. Charles remembered giving it to her during their engagement, when their future had seemed bright and full of promise. She had been delighted with the gift, calling it perfect for keeping her most special pieces safe. Charles hesitated before opening it. This felt different from the other items. This was her private space, her sanctuary for the things that mattered most to her personally. But his sons had specifically asked him to go through everything, wanting to ensure nothing of importance was overlooked or lost to time. With a deep breath, he lifted the delicate lid. Inside, the box was lined with cream-colored velvet, divided into small compartments for rings, earrings, and necklaces. Most of the compartments were empty now, their contents likely moved to safer storage years ago. But, in the largest section, Charles found several items that made his heart race with recognition and pain. There was the sapphire and diamond engagement ring he had given her, the ring that now adorned Catherine's finger as William's wife. Beside it lay a simple gold locket that had belonged to Diana's mother, Frances Shan Kidd. Charles picked up the locket, surprised by its weight, and noticed that it seemed to have something inside it. When he opened it, instead of finding the expected photographs, he discovered a small, folded piece of paper tucked carefully behind the picture frame. The paper was cream-colored, expensive stationery that Diana had always preferred for her personal correspondence. Charles could see her handwriting through the thin paper, though he couldn't make out the words. His hands began to tremble slightly as he realized this was something Diana had hidden deliberately, something she had wanted to keep secret even from those closest to her. For several minutes, Charles simply stared at the folded note, wondering if he had the right to read something so obviously private. Diana had been gone for more than 2 decades, and whatever secrets this note contained had died with her that terrible night in Paris. But, as he sat in the quiet palace room, surrounded by the remnants of a life cut tragically short, Charles felt an overwhelming need to understand the woman he had been married to for 15 years, the mother of his children, the person he had loved and lost in so many different ways. The room seemed to hold its breath as Charles carefully unfolded the note. Diana's handwriting was immediately recognizable, the elegant script that had graced thousands of thank you cards, personal letters, and official correspondence during her years as Princess of Wales. But this writing looked different somehow, more urgent, more emotional. There were places where the ink had smeared slightly, as if tears had fallen on the paper while she wrote. As Charles began to read the words his late ex-wife had penned in secret, he felt the ground beneath his feet begin to shift. This wasn't just a note, it was a confession, a revelation that would challenge everything he thought he knew about their marriage, their divorce, and the events that led to Diana's death. The carefully constructed narrative that he, the royal family, and the public had accepted for decades was about to crumble before his eyes. The note was dated August 30, 1997, exactly one day before Diana died in the car crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris. As Charles read her words, written in what would be her final hours, he realized that Diana had known something, suspected something, or feared something that she had never shared with anyone while she was alive. The implications of what she had written were staggering, not just for the royal family, but for the very foundation of the monarchy itself. Charles set the note down with shaking hands, his mind racing to process what he had just read. The afternoon light had faded while he was absorbed in Diana's words, and the palace room had grown dark and cold. But the chill Charles felt had nothing to do with the temperature. It came from the dawning realization that the woman he had once been married to, the mother of his children, had taken a secret to her grave that could have changed everything. Outside the palace windows, London continued its daily rhythm, unaware that their king had just discovered information that would force him to question not only his past but his future. As Charles sat alone in the growing darkness, Diana's note still clutched in his trembling hands, he knew that his life had just changed forever. The carefully maintained royal protocols, the official explanations, the accepted version of events, all of it was now in question because of words written by a woman who had been silenced forever on a dark night in Paris. The discovery of Diana's hidden note marked the beginning of a journey that would take Charles to places he had never wanted to go, force him to confront truths he had spent decades avoiding, and ultimately challenge his understanding of love, duty, and the price of wearing the crown. As he finally found the strength to fold the note and place it back in the locket, Charles wondered if Diana had somehow known that he would be the one to find it, if she had planned for this moment even as she faced her own mortality. The room was completely dark now, but Charles made no move to turn on the lights. He sat in the silence, surrounded by the ghosts of his past and the weight of revelations that would forever change his future. Tomorrow would bring decisions that could shake the very foundations of the British monarchy, but tonight, there was only the overwhelming presence of Diana's words and the terrible knowledge they contained. Charles spent the entire night in his study, reading and rereading Diana's note by the light of a single desk lamp. Sleep was impossible as the full weight of her words began to sink in. The note wasn't just a confession, it was a detailed account of events and conversations that had taken place in the months leading up to her death, revelations that painted a very different picture of Diana's final year than what the public had been told. The note began with an apology. Diana had written that she was sorry for keeping secrets, sorry for the pain her silence might cause, but that she felt she had no choice. She explained that she had become increasingly paranoid in the weeks before her death, feeling watched and followed wherever she went. But this wasn't the vague sense of unease that had been reported in the media. Diana's note contained specific details about incidents that had never been made public. She wrote about strange phone calls to her Kensington Palace apartment, calls where the line would go dead as soon as she answered. She described cars that seemed to follow her during her private outings, always staying just far enough back to maintain plausible deniability but close enough to make their presence known. Most disturbing of all, she detailed conversations she had overheard during official royal functions, conversations that suggested certain members of the establishment viewed her continued popularity as a threat to the monarchy's stability. Diana's handwriting became more urgent as she described a particular incident that had occurred just 3 weeks before her death. She had been attending a private dinner at the home of a prominent British politician when she accidentally walked into the wrong room while looking for the ladies' room. Inside, she found several men she recognized as high-ranking intelligence officials engaged in what appeared to be a very serious discussion. Although she only caught fragments of their conversation before quietly backing out of the room, what she heard chilled her to the bone. The men had been discussing the Diana problem and debating various solutions that would protect the royal family's reputation and ensure the stability of the monarchy. Diana wrote that she couldn't be certain what they were planning, but their tone and the secrecy of the meeting left her feeling deeply unsettled. She had tried to convince herself that she was overreacting, that her recent struggles with depression and anxiety were making her paranoid, but the feeling that she was in real danger only grew stronger. The note revealed that Diana had confided her fears to only one person, Mohammed Al-Fayed, the father of Dodi Fayed, the man she had been dating in her final months. Al-Fayed had taken her concerns seriously, having his own reasons to distrust the British establishment. He had encouraged Diana to document everything she could remember and to keep a record of any suspicious incidents. This note was that record, written in her own hand as insurance against whatever might happen to her. Charles felt his stomach lurch as he read Diana's account of her final phone call with Al-Fayed, made on the morning of her death. She had called to tell him that she had decided to be more careful about her security and to avoid any public appearances until she felt safer. But she also mentioned something that made Charles's blood run cold. She had received a call from someone claiming to be a journalist who wanted to interview her about her relationship with the royal family. The caller had insisted on meeting that very evening in Paris, claiming to have information that would interest her greatly. Diana had been reluctant to take the meeting, but the caller had been persistent, eventually convincing her that the information he possessed could help protect her sons from future scandal. Against her better judgment, she had agreed to the meeting, planning to see the supposed journalist after her dinner with Dodi. The note revealed that Diana had given Al-Fayed the name and phone number of this mysterious journalist, information that had apparently never reached the official investigation into her death. As Charles continued reading, he discovered that Diana had been keeping detailed records for months before her death. She had documented license plate numbers of cars that seemed to follow her, noted the times and dates of suspicious phone calls, and even taken photographs of men she didn't recognize who appeared repeatedly in her vicinity. She had stored all of this evidence in a safety deposit box in Switzerland, accessible only to her or to someone with a specific code that she had memorized but never written down anywhere except in this final note. The most shocking revelation came in the note's final paragraphs. Diana wrote that she had recently learned something about the night of Charles and Camilla's wedding that had shattered her remaining illusions about her marriage and her place in the royal family. She didn't elaborate on the specific details, but she indicated that she now understood that her marriage had been doomed from the very beginning, not because of incompatibility or the pressures of royal life, but because of a deliberate plan that had been years in the making. Diana's final words in the note were both prophetic and heartbreaking. She wrote that if something happened to her, she wanted Charles to know that she had never stopped loving him, despite everything that had come between them. She asked him to protect William and Harry from the truth of what she had discovered, but also to never stop searching for justice if her fears proved justified. She ended by saying that she hoped she was wrong about everything, that her paranoia was just a product of stress and loneliness, but that she felt compelled to leave this record just in case. The date at the bottom of the note was written in Diana's distinctive hand, August 30, 1997, 11:47 p.m. Charles realized with a chill that Diana had written this note in the early hours of the day she died, probably unable to sleep because of her anxiety and fear. She had died less than 24 hours after putting these words to paper, her fears and suspicions dying with her in the twisted wreckage of a Mercedes in a Parisian tunnel. Charles set the note down and walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens. The dawn was breaking over London, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that Diana had always loved. As he stood there, watching the city wake up to another ordinary day, Charles felt the weight of an extraordinary decision settling on his shoulders. Diana's note wasn't just a historical document, it was a call to action, a plea from beyond the grave for someone to finally seek the truth about what had happened to her. The king knew that pursuing the allegations in Diana's note would mean questioning the official investigation into her death, challenging the findings that had been accepted by the public and the press for more than 2 decades. It would mean reopening old wounds, not just for himself and his family, but for the entire nation that had mourned Diana as the people's princess. The political implications alone were staggering. If there was any truth to Diana's suspicions, it would suggest that elements within the British establishment had been willing to consider extreme measures to protect the monarchy's reputation. But Charles also knew that he couldn't simply ignore what he had discovered. Diana had trusted him with this information, even after everything that had gone wrong between them. She had hidden this note where she knew he would eventually find it, counting on him to have the courage to seek the truth. As the morning light grew stronger, Charles made a decision that would change the course of his reign and, possibly, the future of the British monarchy itself. He would investigate Diana's claims, but he would have to do so carefully and secretly. Too many powerful people had too much to lose if Diana's suspicions proved correct. Charles realized that he might be putting himself in danger by pursuing this investigation, but he owed it to Diana, to his sons, and to his own conscience to finally learn the truth about what had really happened in the months and weeks leading up to that terrible night in Paris. As he prepared to leave the study and begin this dangerous journey toward the truth, Charles took one last look at Diana's note. Her handwriting, so familiar and yet so foreign after all these years, seemed to shimmer in the morning light. Whatever lay ahead, whatever truths he might uncover, Charles knew that Diana's words would guide him through the darkness that was surely coming. The discovery of her hidden note had changed everything, and there was no going back to the comfortable certainties of the past. In the days following his discovery of Diana's note, Charles found himself consumed by a mixture of determination and dread. He knew that investigating his late ex-wife's claims would require utmost secrecy and careful planning. The people Diana had suspected of monitoring her movements and potentially orchestrating her death were likely still in positions of power, and any obvious investigation would put both himself and others at risk. Charles decided to begin by reaching out to Mohammed Al-Fayed, the only person Diana had mentioned trusting with her fears. Al-Fayed was now in his 90s and living in Switzerland, having long since stepped back from public life. The Egyptian businessman had spent years after Diana's death claiming that she had been murdered, allegations that had been dismissed by most as the grief-stricken rantings of a conspiracy theorist. Now, reading Diana's note, Charles realized that Al-Fayed might have been telling the truth all along. The initial contact with Al-Fayed required delicate maneuvering. Charles couldn't simply pick up the phone and call him directly. All royal communications were monitored and logged by security services. Instead, he arranged for a trusted intermediary, a longtime friend from his university days who now worked as a private art dealer, to reach out to Al-Fayed on his behalf. The message was simple: the king had discovered something that belonged to Al-Fayed's late son and wondered if they might meet privately to discuss it. While waiting for Al-Fayed's response, Charles began his own quiet investigation into the events surrounding Diana's death. He used his position to access archived files and reports that had been classified for decades, telling his staff that he was working on a private historical project about his late wife for their sons. The official investigation records painted a picture that was disturbingly different from what had been presented to the public. Charles discovered that there had indeed been numerous security concerns about Diana in the months before her death, but many of these reports had been heavily redacted or withheld from the official inquiry. There were references to credible threats against the princess, mentions of irregular surveillance activities around her residences, and warnings from foreign intelligence services about possible hostile actions being planned against members of the British royal family. Most disturbing of all was a memo dated just 2 weeks before Diana's death, written by a senior intelligence official and marked Eyes Only, highest classification. The memo discussed the increasing security risks posed by Diana's unpredictable behavior and associations and recommended immediate preventative measures to protect the institutional stability of the monarchy. The specific nature of these recommended measures had been completely blacked out, but the timing and tone of the memo made Charles's blood run cold. 2 weeks after his initial overture, Charles received word that Mohammed Al-Fayed would meet with him, but only under specific conditions. Al-Fayed insisted on meeting in Switzerland, at his private estate, with no security details and no official record of the visit. He also demanded that Charles come alone and bring whatever Diana had left that had prompted this unexpected contact. The old man was clearly still deeply suspicious of the British establishment, even when dealing with the king himself. Charles spent days planning how to make this trip without raising suspicions. He eventually decided to combine it with a scheduled visit to environmental projects in Europe, a cause he had championed for decades and which would provide perfect cover for a side trip to Switzerland. He told his staff that he wanted to visit some alpine conservation projects personally and might extend his stay by a day or two for private meetings with environmental scientists. The flight to Switzerland was uneventful, but Charles felt increasingly nervous as they approached Al-Fayed's estate. He carried Diana's note in an inside pocket of his jacket, along with photocopies of the most damaging documents he had uncovered in his preliminary investigation. As his car wound through the Swiss countryside toward Al-Fayed's mountain estate, Charles wondered if he was making a terrible mistake that could endanger not just himself but the entire royal family. Mohammed Al-Fayed was waiting for him in the library of his estate, a magnificent room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound books and overlooking the snow-capped Alps. Despite being in his 90s, Al-Fayed still possessed the sharp intelligence and commanding presence that had made him one of the world's most successful businessmen. He greeted Charles with formal politeness but obvious wariness, clearly wondering what had motivated the King of England to seek this secret meeting after so many years. Charles wasted no time in explaining why he had come. He handed Al-Fayed Diana's note and watched as the old man read it with growing emotion. Al-Fayed's hands trembled slightly as he recognized Diana's handwriting, and tears came to his eyes as he read her final words. When he finished, he looked up at Charles with a mixture of vindication and profound sadness. "I knew she was in danger," Al-Fayed said quietly. "She called me that last morning, terrified but trying to hide it. She said she had received threats but couldn't prove anything. I begged her not to go to Paris that night, told her to come to Switzerland instead where she would be safe. But she was convinced that someone had information that could protect William and Harry from scandal. She wouldn't abandon that chance, no matter what the risk to herself." Al-Fayed then revealed information that had never been shared with any official investigation. Diana had indeed given him the name and contact information for the mysterious journalist who had arranged to meet her in Paris. Al-Fayed had tried to investigate this person after Diana's death, but the phone number led to a disconnected line and the name turned out to be completely fabricated. No such journalist existed at any of the publications the caller had claimed to represent. More significantly, Al-Fayed had kept copies of all the evidence Diana had been collecting about the suspicious activities around her. She had given him duplicate photographs, lists of license plate numbers, and detailed accounts of the threatening phone calls. All of this material had been offered to the official investigators, but they had shown little interest in pursuing these leads, dismissing them as the paranoid fantasies of a woman under stress. They didn't want to find the truth, Al-Fayed told Charles bitterly. The truth would have been too dangerous, too disruptive. It was easier to blame a drunk driver and a handful of paparazzi than to admit that Diana might have been deliberately targeted by people within your own government. Al-Fayed led Charles to a secure room in his estate where he had preserved everything Diana had given him. Spread across a large table were photographs of men Diana didn't recognize who had appeared repeatedly near her residences and frequent destinations. There were copies of threatening letters that had been sent to her home, letters that had been dismissed by security services as the work of harmless cranks. Most damning of all were transcripts of recorded phone conversations between Diana and various officials in the weeks before her death, conversations in which she was repeatedly pressured to end her relationship with Dodi and to avoid any public appearances that might reflect poorly on the royal family. As Charles examined this evidence, a picture began to emerge that was far more sinister than anything he had imagined. Diana hadn't just been the victim of a tragic accident, she had been the target of a systematic campaign of intimidation and surveillance that had ultimately led to her death. The people responsible had connections at the highest levels of British intelligence and government, people who had viewed Diana's popularity and independence as a direct threat to the stability of the monarchy. She knew they were closing in, Al-Fayed explained as Charles studied the documents. That last phone call, she was saying goodbye without actually saying it. She told me she loved me like a father and that she hoped Dodi and I would remember her kindly. She knew she might not survive that trip to Paris, but she was determined to get the information that journalists claimed to have about protecting her sons. Charles felt overwhelmed by the weight of what he was learning. Diana's death hadn't been a random tragedy, it had been the culmination of a deliberate plan to silence someone who had become too dangerous to the people who really controlled Britain. The implications were staggering not just for the royal family but for the entire British political system. If these allegations were true, it meant that elements within the government had been willing to commit murder to protect their interests. As the evening wore on, Fayed shared more details about Diana's final months that painted a picture of a woman who had been increasingly isolated and fearful. She had stopped trusting most of her friends and advisors, convinced that someone close to her was reporting her activities to unknown enemies. She had begun changing her travel plans at the last minute and varying her routes to avoid being predictable. Most tellingly, she had started talking about leaving England permanently, taking William and Harry to live somewhere safer where they could grow up away from the pressures and dangers of royal life. She wanted to disappear, Fayed told Charles. She was planning to take the boys and move to America or Australia, somewhere far from the reach of the people who were threatening her. But she needed evidence first, proof of what they were planning, so that she could protect herself and her children. That's why she agreed to meet with that fake journalist. She thought she was finally going to get the evidence she needed to expose the truth. By the time Charles left Fayed's estate the next morning, he carried with him copies of all the evidence Diana had collected, along with Fayed's own investigation notes from the years following her death. He also had the names of several people who might be willing to help him pursue the truth, former intelligence officials who had grown disgusted with the cover-up and were ready to speak out if they could be guaranteed protection. The flight back to London was a time of deep reflection for Charles. He now possessed evidence that could potentially bring down the government and expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of British society. But he also knew that pursuing this investigation would put himself and his family in the same danger that had ultimately claimed Diana's life. As his plane descended toward London, Charles realized that he was facing the most difficult decision of his life. Did he have the courage to seek justice for Diana, even if it meant risking everything he had sworn to protect as king? Upon returning from Switzerland, Charles found himself living in a state of constant vigilance and mounting paranoia. The evidence Fayed had shared with him was devastating, but pursuing it would require exposing himself and others to enormous risk. The king began to understand the fear and isolation Diana must have felt in her final months, as he too started to question the loyalty and motives of even his most trusted advisors. Charles decided his first step would be to quietly reach out to one of the former intelligence officials whose name Fayed had provided. Sir Marcus Whitfield was a retired MI6 operative who had served in various capacities for over 30 years before leaving the service in apparent disgust shortly after Diana's death. According to Fayed, Whitfield had been deeply troubled by the official investigation's failure to pursue certain leads and had privately expressed doubts about the conclusion that Diana's death was merely a tragic accident. Making contact with Whitfield proved to be a delicate operation. Charles couldn't risk using official royal communication channels, and he needed to be certain that their meeting would remain secret. He eventually arranged for the contact through his old friend from university who had already proven his discretion in facilitating the meeting with Fayed. The message to Whitfield was cryptic but clear. The king had discovered new information about events from 1997 and would appreciate a private consultation about historical security matters. Whitfield agreed to meet, but, like Fayed, he insisted on strict security precautions. They would meet at a small fishing lodge in Scotland that Whitfield owned, far from London and the prying eyes of current intelligence services. Charles would have to travel there alone, without his security detail, and tell no one about the true purpose of his trip. The official explanation would be a private fishing holiday, something the king had done many times before without attracting unusual attention. The journey to Scotland gave Charles time to review the evidence once more and to prepare for what might be his most crucial conversation yet. If Whitfield confirmed what Fayed had told him, it would mean that elements within the British intelligence services had indeed been complicit in Diana's death. If Whitfield denied any knowledge of a conspiracy, it could mean that Fayed's theories were simply the product of grief and paranoia, no matter how compelling the evidence seemed. Marcus Whitfield was waiting for Charles at the remote fishing lodge, a weathered man in his 70s whose eyes still held the sharp intelligence of his years in the Secret Service. He greeted the king with the formal respect due to his position, but there was also a wariness in his manner that suggested he knew this meeting could be dangerous for both of them. As they settled by the fire with glasses of whiskey, Whitfield waited for Charles to explain why he had requested this highly unusual and secretive encounter. Charles began by showing Whitfield Diana's note, watching carefully as the former intelligence officer read her final written words. Whitfield's face remained impassive throughout most of the note, but Charles noticed subtle changes in his expression when he reached certain passages. When he finished reading, Whitfield set the note down carefully and stared into the fire for several long minutes before speaking. "I had hoped this would never surface," Whitfield said finally. Diana was indeed being watched in her final months, and there were people within the service who viewed her as a significant security risk. Her relationship with Dodi Fayed was particularly concerning to certain officials, not because of any personal objections, but because of Dodi's connections to his father's business interests and the potential for compromising information to be shared with foreign entities. Whitfield confirmed that there had been discussions at the highest levels of government about the Diana problem in the months before her death. The princess's growing independence, her criticism of British foreign policy, and her humanitarian work in controversial areas like landmine removal had created what some officials saw as a direct challenge to government authority. Her popularity with the public made any direct action against her politically impossible, but her continued activities were seen as increasingly dangerous to British interests. There was never any formal plan to harm Diana, Whitfield insisted, but his tone suggested there was more to the story. However, there were certainly discussions about ways to limit her influence and control her activities. The concern was that she was becoming increasingly unpredictable and that her actions could have serious diplomatic and political consequences. Charles pressed Whitfield for more specific details about these discussions and the people involved. What he learned made his blood run cold. The meetings Diana had suspected had indeed taken place, involving senior officials from MI5, MI6, and several government departments. While no one had explicitly discussed murdering Diana, there had been detailed conversations about containing the threat she represented and neutralizing her influence on public opinion. The most damning revelation came when Whitfield described the atmosphere within the intelligence services in the weeks following Diana's death. Instead of the somber reflection that might have been expected after such a tragic event, there had been what Whitfield described as obvious relief among many senior officials. Several people had made comments suggesting that Diana's death had solved a serious problem and that the monarchy was now safer and more stable without her continued interference. Whitfield also confirmed that the mysterious journalist who had contacted Diana on the day of her death was likely connected to intelligence services. The technique of using fake journalists to lure targets into vulnerable situations was a standard operational procedure, and the specific details of how the contact had been made matched known intelligence protocols. While Whitfield couldn't prove that this had been an official operation, he was certain that whoever had made that call had professional training and resources. The investigation into Diana's death was compromised from the beginning, Whitfield admitted. Key evidence was either overlooked or deliberately ignored, and certain witnesses were discouraged from providing testimony. There was enormous pressure to conclude quickly that the crash was simply a tragic accident caused by a drunk driver and aggressive paparazzi. Any suggestion of a more complex explanation was immediately dismissed as conspiracy theory. As their conversation continued into the night, Whitfield provided Charles with additional names of people who might have information about the conspiracy surrounding Diana's death. Some of these individuals were still alive and might be willing to speak if they could be guaranteed protection. Others had died under suspicious circumstances in the years following 1997, deaths that had been ruled accidental or due to natural causes but which now took on a more sinister significance. Perhaps most shocking of all was Whitfield's revelation that the conspiracy to monitor and control Diana had begun years before her death. The intelligence services had been keeping detailed files on her activities since the early days of her marriage to Charles, initially justified as routine security monitoring but gradually expanding into comprehensive surveillance of her personal relationships, political views, and private communications. By the time of her separation from Charles, Diana was essentially living under constant observation by people who had come to see her as an enemy of the state. They never intended for it to go as far as it did, Whitfield said sadly. But once the surveillance system was in place, once Diana was classified as a security threat, it became easier and easier to justify more extreme measures. The people involved convinced themselves that they were protecting the monarchy and the country, but they were really just protecting their own power and influence. Whitfield warned Charles that pursuing this investigation further would be extremely dangerous. Many of the people involved in the original conspiracy were still alive and still held positions of power within the government and intelligence services. They would not hesitate to use their resources to protect themselves if they felt threatened by exposure. Charles himself, despite his position as king, could become a target if he was seen as too determined to uncover the truth. "You must understand," Whitfield said gravely, "that these people have already committed murder to protect their secrets. They won't hesitate to do so again if they feel cornered." Diana's death wasn't just a tragic accident, it was a deliberate act by people who believed they were above the law. If you continue down this path, you're putting yourself and your family in the same danger that Diana faced. Despite these warnings, Whitfield provided Charles with crucial information about how to proceed safely with his investigation. He gave him contact details for several former intelligence officers who had been disturbed by their agency's actions and might be willing to provide testimony if proper protections could be arranged. He also provided guidance on how to gather additional evidence without alerting current intelligence services to his activities. As Charles prepared to leave the Scottish Lodge the next morning, Whitfield made one final, chilling observation. The former intelligence officer pointed out that Diana's death had indeed solved many problems for the people who had viewed her as a threat. Her humanitarian work had been curtailed, her political influence had ended, and her potential to embarrass the royal family through future revelations or actions had been permanently eliminated. From the perspective of those who had orchestrated her surveillance and, possibly her death, the operation had been a complete success. "They got exactly what they wanted," Whitfield said as Charles climbed into his car. Diana was silenced forever, and the official investigation ensured that their involvement would never be exposed. But they didn't count on her leaving behind evidence, and they certainly didn't expect that you would have the courage to pursue the truth after all these years. "Be very careful, Your Majesty. These people have everything to lose if their crimes are exposed, and they've already proven they're willing to kill to protect their secrets." As Charles drove away from the remote Scottish lodge, he carried with him the terrible knowledge that Diana's fears had been completely justified. She had indeed been the target of a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the British government, and her death had been the culmination of a systematic campaign to silence someone who had become too dangerous to the people who really controlled the country. The question now was whether he had the courage to expose these crimes, knowing that doing so might cost him everything, including his life. The weeks following Charles's meeting with Marquis Whitfield were filled with an intensity unlike anything he had experienced during his long journey to the throne. The weight of Diana's hidden truth and the dangerous knowledge he had gained from his secret investigations pressed down on him with each passing day. He found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, wondering if his activities had been detected and whether he too was now being watched by the same forces that had targeted Diana. Charles knew that he stood at a crossroads that would define not only the remainder of his reign but also his legacy as both a king and a man. The evidence he had gathered was compelling but circumstantial. While it painted a disturbing picture of conspiracy and murder at the highest levels of government, it might not be enough to convince a skeptical public or to bring the perpetrators to justice. More importantly, pursuing this truth could destroy the very institution he had sworn to protect and serve. The king began reaching out to the other contacts Whitfield had provided, each conversation requiring the same elaborate security precautions and yielding additional pieces of the horrifying puzzle. A former MI5 officer confirmed that there had been active discussions about neutralizing Diana's political influence in the months before her death. A retired government official revealed that certain ministers had been briefed on contingency plans for dealing with the princess problem should her activities become too disruptive to British foreign policy. Perhaps most significantly, Charles made contact with a former aide to Tony Blair who had been present at several high-level meetings in the summer of 1997. This source revealed that the Prime Minister himself had been aware of the intelligence service's concerns about Diana and had given tacit approval for appropriate measures to be taken to limit her influence. While Blair may not have explicitly authorized Diana's murder, he had certainly created an environment where such extreme actions could be justified as necessary for national security. As the evidence mounted, Charles found himself grappling with an impossible decision. He could expose the truth about Diana's death, potentially bringing her killers to justice but also destroying public faith in the government and the monarchy. The scandal would be enormous, likely leading to the downfall of several major political figures and possibly triggering a constitutional crisis that could threaten the survival of the royal family itself. Alternatively, he could remain silent, allowing Diana's killers to escape justice but preserving the stability of the institutions he had been raised to protect. This choice would mean living with the knowledge that his ex-wife had been murdered by agents of his own government while he did nothing to hold them accountable. It would also mean continuing to participate in the official narrative that Diana's death had been a tragic accident, knowing it to be a lie. The internal struggle consumed Charles as he weighed his duty as a king against his obligations as a father, ex-husband, and human being. Diana had trusted him with her final words, counting on him to seek justice if her fears proved justified. She had hidden her note where she knew he would find it, believing that he would have the courage to pursue the truth regardless of the personal cost. But she had also asked him to protect William and Harry from the full horror of what she had discovered, recognizing that the truth could be as damaging as the lies. Charles decided to consult with one final source before making his decision. Through secure channels, he arranged to meet with Catherine Meyer, a former diplomatic colleague of Diana's who had maintained a friendship with the princess until her death. Meyer had been one of the few people Diana had trusted completely, and if anyone could provide insight into Diana's true state of mind in her final months, it would be her. The meeting took place in Meyer's private study, surrounded by photographs and mementos from her decades of diplomatic service. When Charles showed her Diana's note and explained what his investigation had uncovered, Meyer was not surprised by the revelations. She confirmed that Diana had indeed been living in fear during her final months and had confided her suspicions about being watched and threatened. Diana knew she was in danger, Meyer told Charles quietly. She had been receiving anonymous threats for months, and she was convinced that someone within the establishment wanted her silenced. But she was also determined to protect William and Harry from any scandal that might affect their future positions. She was walking a very dangerous line, trying to gather enough evidence to protect herself while avoiding any actions that might compromise her son's inheritance. Meyer revealed that Diana had made preparations for the possibility of her death, including detailed instructions about how her personal affairs should be handled and what information should be shared with William and Harry when they came of age. Most significantly, Diana had expressed her hope that if something happened to her, Charles would be the one to investigate the truth and decide what should be done with the evidence she had gathered. She still loved you, Meyer told Charles with tears in her eyes. Despite everything that had gone wrong between you, despite all the pain and betrayal, she trusted you to do the right thing if she wasn't there to protect herself and the boys. She believed that you would have the wisdom to know whether the truth was worth the cost of revealing it. This conversation crystallized Charles's understanding of what Diana had really asked of him. She hadn't simply wanted him to expose her killers regardless of the consequences. She had wanted him to carefully weigh the costs and benefits of revelation against the need for justice and protection of their sons. Diana had trusted him to make the decision that would best serve not only her memory but also the future of the monarchy and the country they had both served. After months of investigation and soul-searching, Charles finally reached his decision. He would not publicly expose the conspiracy that had led to Diana's death, but neither would he allow her killers to escape all consequences for their actions. Instead, he would use his position and the evidence he had gathered to ensure that the people responsible faced private justice and that such a conspiracy could never be repeated. Working through trusted intermediaries, Charles began a careful campaign to remove key figures from positions where they could threaten others or cover up their crimes. Several high-ranking intelligence officials found themselves quietly transferred to insignificant posts or encouraged to take early retirement. Government ministers who had been involved in the discussions about the Diana problem discovered that their political careers had reached unexpected dead ends, with influential supporters mysteriously withdrawing their backing. Most importantly, Charles established a secret protocol within the Royal Protection Services to ensure that no member of the royal family could ever again be subjected to the kind of surveillance and intimidation that Diana had endured. He created secure communication channels that would allow family members to report threats or suspicious activities without those reports being filtered through potentially compromised intelligence agencies. Charles also took steps to honor Diana's memory in ways that reflected the truth of what had happened to her. He established a private foundation dedicated to protecting individuals who might face retaliation for exposing government wrongdoing, funding it anonymously but generously. He also ensured that Diana's humanitarian work would continue through increased royal support for the causes she had championed, particularly efforts to ban landmines and assist victims of political violence. The decision to pursue private rather than public justice was not easy, and Charles knew that some would view it as a failure of courage or moral responsibility. But he had come to understand that Diana's primary concern had not been revenge against her killers but protection of her sons and preservation of the institution that would one day be their inheritance. By working quietly to neutralize the threat posed by the conspiracy while maintaining the stability of the monarchy, Charles believed he was honoring both Diana's explicit wishes and her deeper hopes for their family's future. In his private moments, Charles often returned to Diana's note, reading her final words and reflecting on the terrible knowledge they had brought him. He had discovered the truth about her death, but that truth came with a burden of responsibility that would remain with him for the rest of his life. He had chosen to seek justice through power rather than publicity, using his position as king to protect others from the fate that had befallen Diana while ensuring that her killers would face consequences for their crimes. The secret of Diana's hidden note and the investigation it had prompted would remain with Charles forever, a private memorial to a woman who had trusted him with her most dangerous secret. As he looked toward the future of his reign, Charles carried with him not only the official memory of Diana as the beloved people's princess but also the private knowledge of her courage in the face of mortal danger and her faith that he would ultimately do what was right for their sons and their country. The discovery of Diana's note had changed everything for Charles, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about the cost of power and the price of protecting the institutions he served. But it had also given him a deeper understanding of the woman he had once been married to and the extraordinary courage she had shown in her final months. In choosing to honor her memory through private action rather than public revelation, Charles believed he had finally found a way to give Diana the justice she deserved while protecting the future she had died trying to secure for their children.